Hello, my name is Marcel Duits. Welcome at this webinar on how to automate CBAM. I am the Chief CBAM Officer of Dubrink, as well President of the International Association for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And I'm looking forward to share today a lot of information about CBAM to help you move forward, because CBAM is a struggle for many companies. And Dubrink actually helps over 2,000 companies at the moment via its platform in one way or the other to streamline CBAM for them. Well, first, a small disclaimer. This webinar is provided for informational purposes only. And I will quickly go to the next page, which actually features our team. Dubrink is based in Prague, but we are located actually in many countries currently around Europe. We're rapidly growing, and on our LinkedIn, you can find the brilliant consultants we have. I'm really proud on our team and how we are solving complex situations, because that's what we see here and there already for quite some time, and that's why we can help a lot of companies just from the experience we have built up. We're one of the leading consulting companies on CBAM, as well a leading CBAM platform, helping companies to reduce CBAM by 95%. Today, I'm going to explain you some parts on CBAM, and I will also show you our platform, how we automate CBAM. Now, if you do not want to hear about any recent information on CBAM, or have an explanation how the calculations work, or how you, for example, calculate the actual benchmarks, all words, if you are not too much into CBAM, are currently abracadabra for you, but I will explain them step by step. If you're not interested in that, and you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to move the video a little bit forward to the moment when I am starting to explain the platform. Dubrink itself, if you join us, I think you're in good company. We are trusted partners for industry leaders, supporting over 2,000 companies around the world, and many of them are also importers. We're working with large multinationals, as well with steel traders, but also smaller steel or aluminium or fertilizer importers around the corner. What is interesting is that large multinationals, for example, recently a large oil company come to us, and those are actually not the companies with the highest volumes. Those are usually the traders who are the most exposed to CBAM these days. The agenda for today, well, we just had the introduction. I would like to explain a little bit about CBAM to make you understand it. During a webinar, we have people that are very experienced, but also people who are starters. And I need to make sure that if you're a starter, you get a little bit up to speed what CBAM actually is. Then we're going to dive into the default values and how to calculate actual benchmarks. If you don't know what benchmarks are yet, I will explain that to you in this webinar. I'm going to show you, if you're importing from different countries, or sorry, into different countries in the EU, I would love to show you how you can streamline that. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the automatization of CBAM. Well, what is CBAM? CBAM is actually a result of the ETS in the EU. We decided that if you are producing emissions, that you need to pay for that, and that goes via the ETS system. Usually for many factories that was free, but from this year it's getting more and more expensive. And the EU says that if you are importing into the EU, it wouldn't be fair that your factory can just produce emissions which are, let's say, very dirty, or many of them use, for example, coal, which is usually cheaper than other methods, and then import them into the EU and, let's say, compete with the producers in the EU. So what the EU agreed is to start CBAM, and CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which says that you could heat up your factories with rubber tires, but once you import into the EU, and CBAM is very customs driven, once you do that, you have to account for the emissions you have emitted and pay for that. From 2027, we will also have UK CBAM, and it looks like there will be many other similar kind of mechanisms being started in the upcoming years in other countries, like, for example, Turkey, Norway. Now, CBAM actually already exists since Q4 2023. That was the date that actually factories that are importing good goods, which are classified as a CBAM good, should report their emissions to the EU portal. But in reality, that barely happened. I think only a few percent of the companies that had to report actually reported. But from the 1st of January, the companies really have to pay. And if you are not an authorized declarant, that means that you are registered as a CBAM authorized importer for the EU, your cargo will get stuck. That actually should be from the 1st of January, but they postponed it to the 31st of March. If you are not yet an authorized declarant for the new CBAM system, feel free to reach out to us. We have provided this process in almost all the EU countries for companies. We're very experienced in that, and if your cargo gets stuck, it's very important that you get your containers moving as soon as possible. Now, in 2026, if you import CBAM goods, you have to pay over that. The tricky thing is that initially you had to pay during 2026, if I remember, per quarter, but the EU says now that you can pay from the 1st of February. What makes it so tricky is that you will not know what the exact price is going to be. So you're importing today, but you will know your exact price only in 2027. By then you have to buy CBAM certificates, and before 30th of September 2027, you will have to make sure that all your emissions are paid by buying those certificates. And then from 2027, every quarter you will need to report to the EU portal and pay certificates. And every year on the 30th of September, you have to close the books of the previous year. If not, the bought certificates will be cancelled. UK CBAM will be introduced from 2027. That will kind of, how do you say it in English, cold turkey, without any transitional period, which CBAM for the EU had. And the UK CBAM will not work via certificates, but it will go via a kind of tax, which will be simply a percentage that companies have to pay over the amount what they have imported. Now, there are a lot of wrong assumptions about CBAM. I will only pay 2.5% tax for my CBAM imports in 2026. I will explain on the way why that's incorrect. CBAM will be cancelled. It's not going to happen because actually it's also not true that CBAM will stay as it is, because the EU already communicated that CBAM will most likely be expanded actually. New products will be included. A lot of products which are from aluminium, which you find in the kitchen, fences, but also complete washing machines. Now, I will explain in a bit that it is not the case that CBAM will be next year just a tax of 2.5%, meaning that you get a 97.5% discount. But we have seen many companies that thought that that would be the case. And in a bit, I'll explain you how the calculation of CBAM works. No worries for those that are advanced here. I will also dive into how the actual benchmarks are going to be calculated. For many companies, that is, I think, very interesting. For those that are new to CBAM, this will be available on YouTube, so you can replay that part a few times. But for now, I move to this one also because if you're registering yourself for CBAM, you're not there yet. Because if your company is less than 2 years old, the EU is asking you for a deposit. And this was one of our clients, for example. They imported, I think, 5,000 tons it was, and they were asked by the EU to deposit €1 million within 30 calendar days. So with CBAM, it's important to understand not just how to calculate it, not just how to do your audit trail, not just how to understand the mechanism by itself, but it's also important to understand what's coming. You know, what is your financial exposure? With that, Dubrink can help you, usually via a 1 or 2 hour consulting session. We can get you up to speed and show you what the risks are for CBAM and how to mitigate them. Now, this is an interesting sheet what comes from a presentation of the European Commission of last year. It shows that at the time they were already thinking of CBAMing a laundry machine. This was actually a think tank, but at the moment this is reality. So indeed, CBAM is expanding. And now we can dive into how the CBAM costs are calculated. This is the calculation which is used by the EU, and I simplify it for you a little bit. But basically, it is like, basically, it is like this, that, basically, it is like this, that over here, you have the actual specific embedded emissions. That means that the factory communicates to you, these are the emissions that we emitted. you can deduct something from that, and that is actually the CBAM benchmark. And the benchmark is the average of the 10 cleanest producing installations in the EU. And the EU actually says, look, you can't produce cleaner than that. So over that part, you do not have to pay. And that's why you can deduct it from the emissions you receive from the factory. However, that amount is getting less every year. At the moment, you can still use 97.5% of that CBAM factor, but every year that percentage goes down. As you can see over here, we are now in 97.5% in 2026. That goes down all the way to 0 in 2034. Is there something else you can deduct from the emissions which you have to pay? Yes, indeed. If the country where you are importing from, let's say China or India or the UK, has its own CBAM system, then you can put their data into this calculation, and you can deduct certain part of the cost which you have already paid there, or which your supplier already paid there. Currently, for example, the EU is talking to the UK how they can integrate this part. It's important to notice that if, for example, let's say in a few years, Turkey has this system, and the price of their CBAM certificate is much lower than in the EU, then the effect of what you can deduct is also much lower. So if you multiply this calculation, so the actual specific embedded emissions minus the CBAM factor times the CBAM factor minus this blue part, which is carbon price paid, which is currently not relevant yet, times the amount of goods, you know how much certificates you have to buy. We can simplify that. But before I do that, I would like to show you that the emissions have a certain price. And you do that by buying certificates. And those certificates, the price are linked to the ETS price. And this ETS price is not that stable. As you can see, in 2006, it was close to 10 euros. It has been almost all the way up to 100. And currently, today, when I record this webinar, it is 71 euros. It is therefore important to realize that, for example, if I go to the next sheet, now as you can see here in March, the price is low. Over here in February, the price is suddenly high, and then it dropped. Meaning that if you're making a calculation of the exposure CBAM for you, you should realize that per ton you might end up paying 20, 30 euros more. What I would like to mention is there are options how to mitigate this risk. If you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to you, and we can connect you with companies that are actually helping to manage these costs. Now, this is the simplified version: embedded emissions minus benchmark times CBAM factor times price. What I would like to show you is the effect of the changing CBAM factor and the changing price. So in this case, with an emission of 2.5 and a benchmark of 1.5 and a CBAM factor of 97.5 and an EUA price and the ETS price of 85, you end up with an 88 euros. Fine, right? But if you remove the CBAM factor, you already go to a price of 212 euros. And eventually, if the EUA price would be 250 euros, you go to 625 euros. And to make it a bit worse, if the emission factor would be 4, let's say default values, you pay 1,000 euros per megaton. And I have even seen default values of 8. So we are now in a situation that we have clients that are, for example, importing screws. And let's say they have an average price of 1,000 euros per ton. And they do not know if next year they're going to get actual data, so verified data from their factory and the whole supply chain connected to that, or default values, which are maybe going to be 1,000 euros. So if their product are 1,000 euros per ton, that means that they have to double their price, at least. However, if they get actual data, they might end up with 88 euros. It's very hard to navigate that. These are things where we advise on. What is important, though, to mention is that there are also still a lot of companies, and maybe you are one of those companies who haven't heard about CBAM, and this is the first day, and you have been selling your products for 88 euros, not even a surcharge on it. So you can imagine that for those competitors that actually are realizing that they might have to pay 1,000 euros per ton, that for them it's extremely difficult to price it like that, because every buyer will, of course, buy from you with low prices, then from them with high prices. And these are market dynamics which are very important to keep in mind at the moment. Now, I will dive more in our platform in a bit, but this is, for example, 731811520. These are indeed screws. Those that are importing screws know that this is their CN code they use a lot. And in here, you, for example, can see that the difference between Serbia default value and Indonesia default value is in this case 500 and what is it? 81 euros per ton. That is massive. That's why we see a lot of companies switching from one supplier to the other just because the country itself has very high default values. And the reason why that is because I can come up with many reasons why I think there's a very small chance you will get default values. One of them, you will get actual values. One of the reasons is, for example, that there are simply not enough verifiers. They're not enough. Only in Q3 we will appoint them, or the EU will appoint them, and then they will have to start verifying. But there are like, let's say, 100,000 of factories, but there may be 1,000 verifiers. Seems to me impossible. Another problem is that if you have a supply chain where you have a steel mill and you have, let's say, 2 producers in between, and eventually you have someone who makes the screws, that you might have the data from the steel mill, and you might have the data from the company you are buying from. But those companies in between, let's say, if they are not verified, then you can only use the actual emissions from your supplier. And all those companies which are connected all the way up to the steel mill, you have to go for the default values. And unfortunately, the steel mill usually produces most of the emissions where you will have to pay the higher price for. There are another 10 of these arguments. That's why it's very important to understand the financial impact of CBAM in your organization. Then there are 2 things, default values, and default values are the values you have to report if you do not have emission data, and there are benchmarks. First, I dive into the default values. They are quite easy to look up in the regulation. You simply go to the country, then you go to the CN code, and eventually you can see over here what the default value is. In 2026, a 10% markup applies. In 2027, a 20% markup, and in 2028, 30% markup. So they are getting very expensive very soon. Now we go to the benchmarks, and their default benchmarks and their actual benchmarks. I actually go to the next slide to explain that. So let me turn on my, here we go, this one, so I can draw. Okay, does it work? Yeah, it works perfectly. Fine. Let's say this is, so the benchmark is the part you can multiply times the CBAM factor and then deduct it from what you are importing. And how it works with benchmarks is that you have the default one and the actual one. So in this overview, we have steel production, hot rolled coil. And first, to create a hot rolled coil, you have sintered ore, pig iron, you create crude steel, and from there you create a hot rolled coil. In this overview, everything what's green are actual emissions, so emissions you know. And that means that you can take the benchmark, which is connected to that process. So the processes you can slice in different pieces, let's say piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, piece 4. And as long as it's green, you can use the individual processes and stack them on top of each other. And that is column A. If you do not know the emissions, then you have to go in B, and B is actually covering everything what's behind it. So let me show you how the calculation works, because it might be that you want to calculate these benchmarks so you can fill in the data in the CBAM calculation, which I just showed you. First of all, this one. Well, crude steel, we don't know what the emissions are. Then to calculate the benchmark, you actually take the 0.44 of over here, and you add to them this one, the default benchmark of crude steel, and you end up at 1.4. That is rather simple, right? Let's take this one, a little bit more complex. We have the precursor pig iron, and we don't know over there what the emissions are. So we take 1.21. Now you might wonder, why is there 1.05? Why do we multiply it with that? That is because in the process of producing crude steel, somehow the mass of the end product is changing, meaning that 105% goes in, and 100% goes out. And that is reflected over here. With benchmarks, you always have to take the input amount. So that's why 1.21 is multiplied times 1.05. Then we have to add to that 0.044 from the HRC, and then we end up at 1.502. The last one is this one, a little bit more complex situation. We first have to take the precursor, number 3. We can take over there, actually this one, we have to multiply it times 1.6. And we also have to go for this one. Then we end up at 1.227. Once we take that, we realize in the next process, the mass is changing, so we multiply that times 1.05, and we add the precursor of number 1, 0.1888. We end up at 1.476. Then we're almost there, because we just have to add the benchmark information of the hot rod coil, and we end up at 1.52. Now, what you see is that the more you calculate it, the higher the benchmarks get. And that is a good thing, because the more you can subtract from the emission you have to report, the lower the overall emission is, and the less you have to pay. Again, this will be available on YouTube. Feel free to go over this a few times. There's a lot of information I would like to share with you in this webinar. But if this is hard, note that this is what we do every day. We can make these calculations for you. We can also, for example, check communication templates you receive from your suppliers. And even though the verifiers are not appointed yet, that means that we can't say in the factory that something is 100% correct. We very often can see, based on the communication template or on the certificates we receive, that the data is not correct. We even see it happening that we are talking to massive fertilizer producers, and we find during the meeting out that they're actually not using the right calculations. They're using GHG protocol, where actually they should work with the CBAM calculation, meaning that the data, what actually was provided to the importers, was not correct. That's where we can add value, I think, and provide you security. What is also interesting to mention is that we hear from verifiers that 90% of the companies that want to be verified are rejected because they are not doing the right thing. And that is, and again, another reason why I think that getting actual data is going to be hard, especially because once the verification starts, there's also not too much time to eventually file the data to the EU before you have to pay. Now, if I go to the next slide, we have our lovely communication template, a rather difficult way how to provide data as a supplier. And what we see is that if you have suppliers, for example, some verified suppliers, or it could be a factory of yourself, which you have verified, for example, in this case by SGS, but maybe also other suppliers, it's impossible in a few years which communication template at which moment was connected with which import line. Was that an actual value? Was that the default value? Didn't they send some new communication templates afterwards? That is a mess. And if you then get an audit, it is not easy to eventually then prove what you've done. That is why Dubrink offers a CBAM calculation platform. And in a bit, I love to explain to you how you can turn CBAM into an exercise which costs you 95% less time. Now, before I do that, if you are a consultant, feel free to reach out to us. We work with a lot of consultants who are working with our platform. They use the platform themselves for their clients, or they are explaining the platform to their clients and stick around as a consultant. But what I think is also very important is those companies that are importing via different countries into the EU. You can imagine that if you import via France, via Portugal, via Spain, via Poland, and maybe in those countries you're using different indirect reps or different companies that help you with customs, that it's very messy to have CBAM managed on a global level, right? And that is why it's possible in the Dubrink system that your custom service provider is managing the data for you. And we see more and more synergies over there. For example, just in the Netherlands, we work with Coring, we work with Centuristics, we work with ALS, and we work with quite some other brands. And if you can pick and choose your custom service provider, and you go in Dubrink and you pick the ones which can facilitate you and consolidate all the data for you, life is going to be much, much, much more easier with respect to CBAM. Now, this was my presentation. I will now move forward to the Dubrink platform to explain you how to automate CBAM. So first of all, note that the Dubrink platform is available in 27 languages. So currently it's English. I am myself Dutch. However, if you speak, for example, Chinese, or let's say, I think this is Vietnamese, you can turn the platform in any language you like. The good thing is that is also the case for your supplier. And we see that the adoption level of our platforms, since we have especially Chinese in the platform, is massive. Well, the platform has several sites. Me and my demo version, I have 3 different sites. I have the site of an indirect rep, I have the site of an importer, and I have the site of a supplier. Note that if you are an importer, you can't just see the data of your supplier, and also the other way around. We don't believe that a catalog is a good idea, where if you upload your data or your clients to an online database of a company, that is going to be visible for everybody, including competitors. With us, it works different. An importer can connect to a supplier. I'll show you how that works. Over here, you can go to suppliers, and you can add a supplier. The supplier you can invite, or you can find the supplier in the database based on, for example, the email address or the registration or tax number. The suppliers you'll see over here in your environment, and every supplier has a unique supplier ID. This ID you could match, for example, with the data from your ERP system. With every supplier, you can see how much you import, what the import lines are, and you can down drill on import level and see what that situation was. Now, before I do that, I actually would like to show you what you need to operate our platform as an input. And CBAM is always customs focused. This is customs data. You can have whatever in your ERP platform. What is going through customs, that's what you report. So in this example, I have an import from a screw importer from China with certain netto weights on a certain import date. I call this PO webinar, but you can put here any number what you want, a reference code, an invoice number, doesn't matter. And over here, I have a supplier ID. I called it Dubrink this time. This is all you need to report CBAM via our platform. Now, I'll give an example how to do that. But before I do that, I actually would like to go to the Insight module. In this module, you can see per import what the effect is. And what's interesting to see is that here you can see what are the imports with, let's say, the heavy impact or the financial heavy impact, or where you imported the most tonnage. So you can decide with which suppliers you should start a commercial discussion to bring the cost down. You can also see on the supplier side which suppliers you're importing the most goods from. Last but not least, the forecasting tool. And this tool is used a lot. I will give you an example on 73181520. Those are screws. Let's say we want to see the difference in cost between India and, no, let's say Indonesia first, because I know that one is quite high. Let's say India. Let's say we have China. And let's also say that we have Serbia. There we go. And let's add some items with actual values. Let's say we are importing from Egypt, and the factory actually says we have actual values, and the actual value is 3.8. The benchmark needs to be calculated, right? We don't have that now, and it will take the default benchmark for now. Let's forecast this, and as you can see, the platform nicely shows per quarter, per year, what the difference is. Well, as you can see, the difference is massive, and it's important to take that into account. This tool is used to forecast. We have taken into account the most realistic assumptions. Of course, we can't predict the future, but a lot of companies are using this forecasting tool. You can add, for example, certain variables, and this should help you navigate the risks and prices of CBAM in the upcoming years. Well, let's use the platform. Let's go to imports. I actually imported a lot of identifies PO webinar because in the demo, which we use this demo on a daily basis, many times I, of course, had to get rid of all the company demos we had. So you will find here a lot of PO webinar. But usually, of course, you have over here literally the import names of the products you're importing. How it works, you go to upload, you say select the file, you select the file which you have to import, you map it, and mapping is just a matter of checking if the data from the Excel file is matching the way how the platform calls that certain input. So a CN code is in this case a commodity code, country of origin is country of origin, name is product name, netto weight is in tons. You do this once and you're done. Now I'm going to import the Excel file, and we're actually almost ready. CBAM doesn't get easier like this, because when I go to import, I see over here that I have imported the data, and I now only have to submit it and send it to the factories. And as you can see at the moment, it is in progress. Now, when I switch to the factory, I can show you that they actually, that's interesting to mention, every side of the platform has an instruction video, and most of the companies are actually able to manage the platform because it's that intuitive just by following the instructions of the video. We can help you onboard, we can organize webinars where we can onboard all your factories at once, and we can also do that one-on-one. We also have partners in China and India who can help with that, but many companies actually use this video. Well, over here, as you can see, we have the data request, and those are that's the data what we need to send back to the importer. In this case, we're talking about this screw importer that is using one process, and the only thing what they need to do is once in a month log in and respond this data back. It takes them a few seconds. In general, signing up for the platform is done very fast, and entering their data is also very fast. Now, if I open one of those data requests, you see there are 4 options. And we have here the commodity code, the net weight, the product name, the category, the due date, the PO number, so they can track what they need to return. But they can say, first of all, we have no data. They can say, look, I'm actually just forwarding that to you, but I'm not a producer, so I have to select a supplier, a sub-supplier. Works the same, you just add the supplier. And I have to say that if a factory does not want to cooperate or doesn't want to work with the Dubrink platform, we can create a supplier environment for you, enter the data in there, and you can still keep on reporting. Now, then there are 2 other options available. One is external data, and the last one is platform calculation. External data is super easy. It actually means that you had, for example, SGS, Bureau Veritas, and LQA verifying the data as a supplier, and you just want to enter that in the platform, because that's then the process, because CBAM is process-based, it's not product-based, it's process-based. All the screws from this process most likely have the same emissions. And how you do that is, let's say we calculated the process of screws 2026, the commodity code is 7318.520. If I don't completely fill it in, it asks me actually to select the right code. You select the installation. Well, in this case, that's a demo supplier. You have here the direct emissions, which you read from the file of your verifier. You add the embedded electricity, and you attach proof. Now, you save this, and from now on, the only thing what you do is once you get a data request, you open it, you select external data, you select the process, and you return the emission on a line level back to the importer. There's also another way. Factories can calculate in our platform the emissions. And that, for example, helps in getting ready for the verification. I will do one very quick. This will be available on YouTube. You can slow it down if you want. But let's calculate the process screws of 2026, version 2, let's say, because I see I've already done one in the previous webinar. The first thing you do is you select the aggregated goods category. And when we talk about screws, we of course not talking about hydrogen or ammonia. No, those are iron or steel products. We select the installation. We say that we're actually calculating or we're reporting per 100 tons. And we have to add a precursor because we are the ones finalizing the screws or producing the screws, but the wires or the steel is not produced by us. All I now need to do is enter the direct and the indirect emissions as well the data what comes from my supplier. Well, first of all, I put the direct emissions. Over here, I already have some examples ready, but calculating an emission in our platform is not difficult. Let's say this factory is running on gas. Gas is CO2. Let's say they don't have difficult measurement systems, so we calculate it. And here I call it natural gas, 2026. Then the method is, in this case, combustion, because gas is burned. The data quality, well, we can say recommended and add a lot of stuff, but actually many factories go for minimum requirements. Then I select the fuel, again, gas. I say how much I used. And as you can see, automatically, the emissions for this, actually the CO2 emissions are automatically calculated. And when I go back, I can see that over here, the one which I calculated shows up, and I can add it to the process. But let's say this factory has actually 3 production lines, and it's equally dividing the gas over those 3 production lines. In that case, 33% of the emissions are used for this process we're calculating. Now I complete it, then I have to add the electricity, will not be taken into account in steel, and for example in iron aluminium production, but for example for fertilizers and cement, it is important. Let's say in this case it's public available data. I add some data, I add the proof from the purchase agreement, and here we go. This part is done. Last but not least, the precursor, and that is the material supplier, let's say the wire supplier. Let's say they don't produce it themselves, they purchased it and they purchased 100 tons. The country of origin is China. And now I have to add here the emissions, which I get from my supplier by providing me a verified document. If that's not the case, you have to go for default values. And you do that over here by entering the material you have used as an input. And we have our calculation ready. Emissions are calculated, I'm sorry, a little bit high, and I save it. From now on, the only thing what the factory has to do, it's quite simple. They go to data request, they select, they respond, they select the right process, and they send it back to the factory. Sorry, to the importer. That's it. Takes them literally a few seconds. But you as an importer, you avoid that you have to manually calculate everything, because now the fun starts. Once you go to the importer side, again, you also have a video, and we open that import, we see that the data has been returned. One was provided with third-party data, the rest was calculated in our platform, and the status is completed. Green means actual values, gray means default values. Over here, it's still empty. Why? Because this is where it will be shown if data has been verified. It's not yet in the platform because it's not an option yet, but the moment that will happen, we will show there to you if the data is verified or not. Because the platform needs to take into account with respect to the reporting if the data is verified, because you can get actual data, but if there's no verification, it is kind of useless. Every import has a nice PDF. So if there's ever an audit, you can pull them up and you can literally say what you've done, and per line, the calculated data is available for you. We show the supplier, never the sub-supplier, because suppliers don't like to always show who are their sub-suppliers. And what is interesting is that after 1 year, when you have received all this data from all those suppliers, you just go to reports and you say create a report. And what you'll see is that you have there all the imports. And those imports you can select and you can press next. And in one document, you can report this to the EU portal. Now, items which are not filled in by the factory are automatically become default values. items that are verified become actual values. And like this, you save yourself a lot of hassle. Now, if you're interested in this platform, what we can do is we can give a one-on-one and we can walk you through the platform. But if you want to be fast, up to speed with Dubrink, if you would like to automate your CBAM, but if you could use a little help, reach out to us. In our office, we speak fluent French, Spanish, Dutch, English, Slovak, Czech, and quite some other languages. So with a little bit of luck, we can support you in your native language. This is, in our opinion, how to automate CBAM. And I think what we now will do is we will go and answer some questions which are part of this webinar. Those on YouTube, I wish a great day because the questions are not available on YouTube. And for the others, we will now continue to the questions. Thank you.